Hello, everyone. Today we have the esteemed Dr. Stephen Halpern, longtime musician and pioneer in sound healing. He began producing music in the early 70s, and he's a Grammy Award nominated multi-platinum selling record recording artist. And he's a very decorated individual. Pleasure to have you here today, Dr. Halpern.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm gonna start off with a sort of like simple question, but it can sort of be deep in some ways. Give a brief introduction of like yourself, your musical and spiritual journey, what sparked it, and most importantly, what is music to you?
Music is life. Music is a portal to other dimensions and to higher awareness and to spiritual attunement and oneness. But how I got to that was number one, always being highly sensitive to sound. I actually hear beyond what most humans hear physically, much to the surprise of the audiologists who tested me. And as a kid, I was always attracted to certain kinds of sounds, certain music. When I got to auditoriums that were empty or tunnels where I experienced echo and reverberation, I didn't have the words, the vocabulary of that's a mystical experience, but it triggered something in me that felt very ancient. But uh, in high school, there wasn't any knowledge base to tap into that. When I got to college, I started, was also at the same time that I started learning about Edgar Cayce, talking about the ancient use of music in the healing temples in Egypt. And of course, learning about Pythagoras in ancient Greece, the healing powers of music. And I wanted to know what healing music, why had that concept been forgotten, and how could we reawaken it in the 20th century?
Mhm.
And mostly I was doing reading and reading all the books that were possible. And I read books on yoga and the yoga philosophy of sound and mantra. I read books about African trance music and a whole lot of ethnomusicology things, but it was mostly something with the left brain,
Mhm.
intellectualizing. And I began to pray, though, as my teachers, who are artists and musicians, would tell us about in their tradition, they, just like in ancient Greece, they would pray to and set their intention to attune and to commune with their muse. And having studied scales and chords and melodies and lots of things in my career as a trumpet player and guitar player, that really attracted me to I want to to connect with my muse, but never really dreamed that that would happen in 1965 or 68, 69. That was something that happened thousands of years ago. But a series of experiences playing music, particularly, opened me up to where the music played itself through me, where I didn't have to think about what I was playing, but that the music would just flow. And I would wonder, well, how is that happening? And my teacher said, well, then you should study with these people or read this book, et cetera, et cetera. And for a number of years, that was what I would do until November 1969. I found myself in a sacred redwood grove power place when I was in California, just on a 2-week visit,
Mhm.
getting ready to go back to graduate school, where I had an experience in meditation where I not only heard a new kind of music, but I also got a message. One of the only times I've ever heard a voice that said, this is the music that you've been praying to hear for the 20th century. Your job is to share it with the world. Now, I'm a jazz musician, just graduated college, going into graduate school. I have no money. I knew nothing about business on any level, uh, and I don't even have a piano. But the sounds I heard sounded something like a keyboard, but there was nothing exactly like that I had ever seen. But within a very short number of weeks, I had an experience where I actually saw one of the very first of the electric pianos that I feature on a lot of my music that no one else was playing in that way. Miles Davis had gotten one and made Herbie Hancock play it on one of the jazz albums. But when was in a band opening for Herbie, I heard the instrument and had an out of body experience. And when right, I said, "What is that? And where could I get one?"
Hmm.
And that was he wasn't put he said, "Oh, it's just a Miles made me play it." It wasn't. It was an instrument for him. For me, it was a way of life. And I believe that if my first album had been played on grand piano, it would not have had the effect that it had on people because the tone was part of things. So as I mentioned, and in ancient India and other traditions, it's not just a note, but it's a tone, and the tone is a three-dimensional, a living being in the theory of raga. And I've studied some. I'm not a trained Indian musician, but I've studied with certainly the works of uh, Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan, and did a recording with a master vocalist from India, Dr. Sunil K. Bose, who started sharing some of the secrets. He was a vocalist,
Hmm.
but that was really the impetus to get deeper into the aspect. But it was also the fact that when people would hear my music and said, "We've never felt so peaceful or had such a deep meditation as listening to your first album. How did you learn to do that? Where does that come from?" And I didn't have a great answer to that. But I was also challenged by two world famous scientists.
Hmm.
If your music is something unique, you need to prove it. You need to do scientific research. And in that case, they were saying biofeedback research, brainwave research. Now, this is 1973 when most people didn't know what a brainwave is. Still today, a lot of people don't know what brainwaves are. But it was also using GSR, galvanic skin response, like a lie detector on the surface of the skin. But
Hmm.
also, one of my mentors had just come back from Russia and had been at the conference with Kirlian photography, the device that could visualize and show you the layers of at least the fundamental layer of the aura. People didn't know what an aura was. Well, it's the electromagnetic energy field. People don't know that we have an electromagnetic energy field. But that was the impetus to do the research, to be the first one out there to do research on Kirlian photography and music, as well as brainwaves and music. And guess what? Most of the media, most of the people, certainly in the music industry, we don't care about that. What's a
Hmm.
brainwave? We don't care. Where's the beat? Where are the melody? Where are the words?
Yeah.
And so it was, I basically had to start a whole new genre that wound up being called New Age music
Hmm.
as just some category to begin to talk about this because it wasn't jazz or rock or classical or pop. And that's part of how I became known as the father of New Age music.
Hmm.
But along the way, a lot of the more traditional people uh, said, we're not comfortable talking about spirituality in music. Just give us the notes. Don't tell us what your intention was. And the fact that all these things affect the way the music makes people feel, they were not interested in it.
Hmm.
But I learned early on from, in fact, reading in graduate school the philosophy of ancient Chinese painters. Invoke chi or do not paint.
Hmm.
One of my mottos in music is invoke chi when I'm recording or do not record.
Hmm.
If I wasn't in a good place, even though I had a session scheduled, I'll do something else. And much to the dismay of my business manager, you spent 4 hours and you didn't record anything. It wasn't right.
Uh-huh.
And, I fired him and got on with my life. But the concept of the responsibility of the musician to be in attunement, to be in alignment and connected spiritually and seeking to serve the audience, very different than our perspective in the jazz world, where it was just like in the classical world. I've practiced for 20 years. I know all the scales. I know all this. And you will be impressed, damn it, with my virtuosity.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of praise for being such a hotshot trumpet player.
Hmm.
But no one ever said, your music changed my life. Your music saved my child. Your music helps my child sleep. Your music, I have an autistic kid. your music brings him out of having a tantrum.
Hmm.
I had no idea about that whole field until people started sending me letters and telling me how the music was affecting them. They didn't have to read a reviewer or a critic saying his music doesn't have a regular beat. But then, in the 1990s, people like Dr. Deepak Chopra and Wayne Dyer would talk about the gap between thoughts. When you're talking about meditation and tuning into a higher level of reality, if you're so busy, it doesn't leave any room for spirit to come through. And most music, but even in the new age genre, is so busy, there's no room for for spirit to come through. It's all filled up. John Bradshaw described my music as music of being, not music of doing. Most everybody else's music is about doing, and I used to live in that world, so I know about doing, and I
Yeah.
was a good doer. But it's higher for me as a recording artist when I'm in the zone, in the studio. There are times that I don't feel my body. There are
Mhm.
times that I finish a 5 or 10 minute performance that I have no idea what I just played. It's only when I listen to playback that I hear. There's sometimes in concert, it's happened, and also in the studio, I look down and this is without any other artificial substances or natural substances, where I'm floating above the piano bench.
Wow.
That's what it looks like to me, and I'm saying, oh, I hope I can still reach the keyboard. You know? And those have been just really breakthrough moments for me where I've learned to trust. And I also learned from some of my spiritual teachers that number one, it's not all me. I, a lot of musicians get it. Mozart would talk about, people say, Mozart, how do you record? How do you compose? He said, well, I might be walking down the road and suddenly I'll hear music in my head and I thank God that it sounds Mozartian. Well, I thank God that it sounds Halpernian
Mm.
because sometimes my head will be filled with music and other times I don't hear the music until I play it. And
Okay.
if you ask me, stop me in the middle of one of those phrases, what did you just play? I have no idea. What are you going to play next? I have no idea. I am so deep in the silences and the spaces between the sound that's where I am led. And what I've learned is that I work with my guides, my spiritual advisors, and tap in what some of us in the spiritual music field call co-composers.
Mhm.
And it's not just one. I've had uh, performances, recordings in the studio where I felt the presence of Alexander Scriabin, who was a Russian mystical composer.
Mhm.
And suddenly I started playing things with both hands that I'd never played before. And I had just read his new biography and had an experience where uh, I had a big cold sore pop out on my lip as I'm reading the new biography on April 16th in the Bahamas at a yoga conference at Shivananda Yoga Ashram. And
Uh-huh.
I turned the page and said, Scriabin died from a huge cold sore on his lip
Oh,
on
wow.
April 16th. And I freaked out and I, closed the book, ran under the covers back in the cabin. So, and I've been told that there is, some soul connection between me and Scriabin and some others. I can't speak, directly. I've never had a voice said, "Hi, I'll be your channel today." But over the years, I've had some things that are witnessed by other people that I'll be talking about in my memoir, and some I even talk about, like on the album Eastern Peace, where it was witnessed by other people who work with Uri Geller and Dr. Andrei Puharich that were known ET contactees.
Mhm.
And when I was invited to have a session with these people, some magical things happened. In fact, since you're a scientist, we're recording, there's a cassette, a reel to reel little cassette
Mhm.
on the coffee table when I am told to go over to the piano and we'll do a little demonstration and the thing. But the voice says, for the demonstration, turn the tape recorder off.
Mhm.
And I say, nobody move. How will they know? Because there's no
Yeah.
being in the room. The voice is coming through the channel.
Yeah.
At the end, I do what I'm doing. We come back, and he says, "Do you remember everything I told you?" I go, "No." And we said, haha, but we recorded because we didn't turn the tape off. And we reverse the tape and we play. And the last thing we hear is, okay, now I want you to turn the tape off. You hear my voice says, nobody move. How will they know? And then there's blank for 7 minutes. The
That's
tape is still going. There was no physical way that
crazy.
that could happen.
Yeah, that's
I've spoken to recording engineers. I've been in studios. There's no way you could not have something recorded that was recording a second earlier.
hmm
It was a magical thing. And 3 months later, I'm in the recording studio and I felt that same vibration. And the entire side one of Eastern Peace just flowed out. And I was in the zone. By that time, I'm working with my engineer for a year and a half.
hmm
And I had established a protocol. Always keep the tape recorder recording. You never know when something's going to happen. So I didn't have to break trance and go put on a fresh reel of tape. I just, said, something's happening. Put on the tape. I'll see you in a half hour. And that was how I learned. And all that consciousness, that energy, that higher dimensional energy is recorded because music is a carrier wave for consciousness. As a scientist, and I was at conferences with more quantum physicists and scientists like Dr. William Tiller from Stanford, who were pioneers in that field in explaining that you could record consciousness.
hmm
One of my first experiences and experiments was to take an ocean recording that I recorded and beam fearful thoughts on one 5 minute segment and the same ocean sending thoughts of love. And we played it for a couple of classes of college students.
hmm
And they said, well, I like that one. That one feels really nice, but I hated that one. It's exactly the same ocean. There was no extra sound added, just the intention of consciousness.
hmm
And, in 1973, you couldn't talk about that publicly very much. And, but I've been talking about that for the last 50 years and called all sorts of names by people who are ignorant and
hmm
don't understand anything about consciousness. But now there's more and more people opening up to that awareness, but it's still kind of far out. The fact that how a performer's level of stress and ego can affect the performance and how it is affecting the audience. I had my own experience, but the person who really did a lot of research on that was Dr. John Diamond, a psychiatrist originally from Australia,
hmm
who I read about in Psychology Today in 1975.
Yeah.
Called him up in Australia and said, I want to meet you. When are you coming to the US? I'm going to be there next month. And I met him and studied with him. And he would use muscle testing as a way
Oh,
of determining, is the musician in a state of balance and equanimity and attunement, or is he coming from ego? Is he playing with love? Is he playing with the ego? And that was a huge, huge breakthrough because it really validated these concepts that we're talking about. So what people are picking up on and what you are picking up on is I am a channel for this music, but it's more than just playing a crystal bowl or a Tibetan bowl, which you could also then impose and use that sound as a carrier wave for consciousness. But
sorry to interrupt. Could
yeah,
you define carrier wave for those
yes,
who aren't aware?
good question. Okay, so my understanding, not being a physicist, is if you have a sound, there's a wave for it. You asked a question about cycles. When we hear sound, is typically something that goes like a sine wave.
Yeah.
When you see it on an oscilloscope, it goes up and down and up and down, or a sawtooth, it'd be jagged, but it's something that repeats over time. Noise is just random,
Okay.
but music and a carrier wave, well, like radio, it's a signal that's on one frequency,
hmm
but you can attach and use that frequency as what they call a carrier wave and attach and link consciousness
Okay.
or other in the bad sense of viruses or other things to certain electronic signals,
hmm
and it uses that radio signal or 5G
Uh-huh.
nowadays is being used, or the music as a carrier wave to get so that you get an effect that's more than just the music.
Okay.
And that's why when people play the same notes that I play. And I've heard some people copy my music, and some of them do it pretty well. Most don't do it that well. They don't have the consciousness, and I could feel the difference. And people can say, "Well, that one sounds like you, but it doesn't feel the same."
Hmm.
And that's where John Diamond wrote. So you can play a perfect scale, in music, but if you're playing out of ego and not with love, it will actually stress the listener.
Hmm.
And that's where the music becomes a carry-away for consciousness. And a lot of that is unconscious. I've been at concerts where when the soloist is getting ready to begin, I feel a tightness in my chest. And I remember the first time I felt that and spoke to the person next to me and says, "Boy, I was feeling good a minute ago, but when the soloist comes on, do you feel a tightness in your chest?"
Uh-huh.
And they look at me like, "You're pretty weird." And they get up and move away.
Because they're just
But,
not aware.
right.
They're not
But
able to
I,
sense that. They don't like they're not like attuned to the like these different they're not sensitive enough in a way.
right.
Yeah.
And I was, and so that was before we knew what the word empath was. Some of us are more sensitive to, pollen and allergies. Some of us are more sensitive to vibrations, to electrical sensitivity or certain foods. But I've been always allergic to a lot of these things, or sensitive to all these things. I hear things that other people don't hear physically, as let us feel them.
So if every or if most music has intention, um, I guess what separates mainstream music or high like low vibrational music from high vibrational music?
Great
And
question.
yeah, what I mean by that, sort of like to expand, low vibration intends to elicit addiction, fear, um, attachment to the music itself, and high vibration is more on the sort of awakens different aspects of your consciousness and um, allows you to sort of experience like trance states, higher states, higher like states of being able to tap into your creativity and like further on. Yeah.
Right. Well, again, some of the most popular genres that sell amazing tonnage of albums and now have millions and billions of streams are the lower vibration ones. Certainly the rap, the heavy metal, the death metal, the goth. I mean, you don't even need to hear the music. You look at some of the imagery on the album covers, and it's
Mhm.
all about death and anger, and that's and that negative consciousness is imbued by the singers, by the rappers, by the musicians into the music. That's where they're coming from. And yes, we do. Uh, it's something that I learned early on. I can't even review anymore. I gave up being a reviewer because I refused to be forced to listen to crap like that. That would make me. I'd have a hangover for 5 days. Just listen to some of that. And people, but the more you listen to it, the more you get accustomed to it. That's low vibration. Uh, uh, Dr. Was it Richard Hawkins or David Hawkins
Mhm.
uh, was able to set up a system where he could rate the frequencies of different music, and
Uh-huh.
mine was like one of the highest, he said, and of course rap and heavy metal was at the bottom.
Uh-huh.
So there's all these different aspects, and you look at, in order to be a famous rock star, you got to have a huge ego. So, because you got to put up with a lot of stuff that's, maybe not so good or just difficult in
Mhm.
order to get out there, to be on the road, night after night. So that will encode itself into the music. That's, uh, and yes, it's not to say there's not some high vibration music from Beyonce or Celine Dion or some of the other people, but that's not what they're not focusing on consciousness. It's
Mhm.
the words, it's the emotions, it's the this. It's back in when I was a kid, it was Dick Clark saying it has a good beat, you could dance to it. So there was those aspects, but there's room for everything. And my job from the beginning was to remind people and to put this information out there to go to help wake them up. Go, oh yeah, there's more to music than just a beat. There's
Mhm.
more to music than just playing fancy scales all the time.
Yeah.
It's like the space between the notes, and that's what again Deepak Chopra was talking about, the gap between thoughts. When I'm recording, that's where I am. I'm in the gap between thoughts. I don't rehearse before I'm doing a new recording. I
Yeah.
get into the zone and let the music flow through me. And I don't know, sometimes it's just me. Sometimes I could feel there's an additional aspect. And there was sometimes I'm just surfing on the wave of sound
Mhm.
and I just kind of sit back and let my fingers play. And that's some of the most amazing music I've ever recorded.
Mhm.
But no one says, okay, now we want, in fact, when I first wrote the Copyright Office to register my first copyright, they said, we can't give a copyright to someone who doesn't have a body. So I go, okay, so I have to take credit for it. And, went on from there.
Okay. That's pretty cool. So I had so you always mention like you mentioned Pythagoras before, and you mentioned a lot of like sine, cosine waves, and like patterns that your music sort of like sort of I don't know elicits. Sometimes when I do listen to your music, I do see patterns like in my mind's eye.
Aha.
Um, I had a question about that regarding cymatics, and
Yes.
the question is, um, how what do the symbols that appear on the cymatic sand tables, um, what can we make of them? And I know in a previous interview you mentioned that you read Carl Jung's mandalas,
Yes.
and he talks a lot about how symbols have sort of meaning to them, which is a process called divination. So I'm more curious to see or curious about how sort of did you start off with seeing what notes produced those sort of things?
Uh, Kind of neither.
Okay.
Uh, from Carl Jung and the mandala of speaking Om into what was called the tonoscope, we can see that in certain cases, the sound that is made produces geometries like a round circle when you make the O sound, and then when you close your mouth to do the you get these series of interlacing triangles as a function of diminishing harmonics.
Mhm.
That was one of the only ones that had a clear uh, relationship to the mantra
Uh-huh.
and the image that the ancient yogis saw, and that's why that's the mantra. That's why that's on my chakra album with the Sri Yantra
Upper suite. Yeah.
behind it. Now, I was the first American, along with Gene Houston, to be introduced to the science of cymatics in London in 1977 at the big conference. And I was the first one to publicize it. And that's one of the reasons I rushed my first book into print,
Mhm.
because this was sound evidence that sound and music could affect your physical body.
Yeah.
So my relationship to cymatics was more in the fact that you could take a sound, and as you raise the frequency, the image in the sand or the liquid or the powder would change. And that was maybe as far as we took it, but that alone was a breakthrough for people who said, how do we know that sound can affect our bodies? That was a very good question, because I never learned that in high school music or college music. That we knew as the volumes in rock music got louder that you could feel it in your body. When I started playing, no one talked about feeling music in their body. That was not a concept. But when we started playing with amplifiers, and as a guitar player, I'm right in front of my guitar amp, I
Mhm.
could feel that in my body. And then the audiences, of course, as the volumes got louder, they could feel in their body, and you had the people standing in front of the speakers for all the whole body resonated. But cymatics was at that level. Now there's much more research being done with it, but the basic concept was it demonstrates that sound does have these effects, and it's a function of frequency, not but it's frequency and the sound itself. So that the same frequency, let's say 440 cycles per second, a nice A note,
Mhm.
played on a violin versus played on my electric piano or a French horn, create very different images. And from the first book on cymatics, I use one of those slides in all my lectures and would always say, okay, now this is the same note, played by two different instruments, and it was, in this case, it was a smoke-filled glass container.
Hmm.
Uh, which one is the violin? And people are thinking of a violin, and which one is a French horn? And one of them was all jagged smoke things, another one's very smooth. And the smooth one, people said, oh, that's a violin. And
Hmm.
it turned out it was exactly the opposite. The violin has very jagged, sawtooth waveforms, whereas the French horn and my electric piano, the Rhodes electric piano, produces more like a sine wave, more like tuning forks. And that's why tuning forks and crystal bowls, quartz crystal bowls, are such important instruments and tools in the sound healing field. They put out sine waves, and that's something that the body is able to ingest and take in much easier than something that has a shrill or dissonant or sharp edges to it.
Hmm.
My first albums would talk about, and the critics would say, his albums don't have any sharp edges. There's not enough contrast. And I say, that's exactly right, because I don't want that contrast.
Hmm.
And, if I was doing a concert somewhere, I said, if you can't find me this or this synthesizer or this kind of piano, I cannot do a concert, because I cannot play on a Yamaha DX7, back 40 years ago, because the sound would be like splinters in my body. So I couldn't get into the mental state to actually play. And a lot of musicians love that instrument, and that's why there's room for all of us in the world. But that's where cymatics was. Now, you also asked about the difference between music's tuned to either an A, like in orchestras nowadays, at 440 cycles per second,
Yeah. Yeah.
versus A at 432 cycles per
Yeah.
second. So that's what's now out in the world, but most people don't know that in Mozart's day, A might have been 428 cycles per second, much lower. And then there's a 438 cycles that's tuned to the inside of the Great Pyramid in the King's Chamber. So why would, and how we know about this is because of pipe organs. When you tuned a violin to 432 or 436 or 440, the strings have turned to dust since Mozart's day, but the
Hmm.
pipe organs are still tuned. And what was happening back then is that if you're a musician from Vienna, you couldn't go to France and play with their pipe organ because it's tuned differently.
Hmm.
And that was when, in 1913, there was an international conference where they decided that, also because this is before microphones existed, we can project sound better uh, when you make the strings a little tighter. There were some other theories that say the Nazis or other people set 440 as the frequency because it was less healthful than tuning it to A432. I'll leave that for other conspiracy theorists at this point. But as I started doing research, the first things I heard that they said this is music at 432, it was crappy music that I didn't like listening to. So it didn't matter if what it was tuned to, and from which I made a very simple statement: bad music tuned to 432 is not as good as good music at 440, but good music at 432 can be even better.
Hmm.
And how I started doing my own research was to record an album, because all my albums were originally recorded at 440, and then we would remaster them using different computer programs to just lower the pitch.
Hmm.
But then when you listen, it's difficult because when you listen to one song followed by another one very quickly, whichever you listen to second doesn't sound right. I started doing research. I want to know if I could feel the difference between meditating at 8 or 10 or 4 cycles per second.
Hmm.
Well, I have access to an engineer and a studio of my own music. So I would make my own recordings and I could feel the difference. And that was how I started really going public with this. Well, the A note that relates to C at 256 cycles per second, if you double that, it's C at 512 cycles per second. So there's A that's closer to the upper C, and that's where A432 comes from. A440 doesn't relate to the earth at all.
Hmm.
And that's where the theory of tuning music to 432 hertz makes a lot of sense. The problem is, you're not going to re-record 400 years of music. All the albums that are out there are not going to be redone. But what I've done in my own career is I have already converted and remastered and re-recorded a lot of my major albums like Chakra Suite and Sound Healing and uh, Deep Alpha and Deep Theta tuned to 432. And as I listen to them, the two things I notice are the sound is mellower because it's a little bit softer, but
Hmm.
non-musicians wouldn't notice it unless you compared it side by side to the 440. But my experience of my own music, it feels even deeper. It feels gentler. It feels smoother. And it's the same exact notes. I didn't play it over because I couldn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
We just tuned it down in the studio through the Pro Tools, digital technology. So everything's the same except the tone. And I have been amazed that it was that uh, noticeable. But where it really changed, and I would recommend to anyone for themselves, is when I was chanting Om from my Om Zone album. It was originally recorded at 440, and then I was doing some other research with a guy that had recorded inside the Great Pyramid. He says the pyramid is tuned to 428 hertz. So Om at 428 hertz. Well, I was in the pyramid, and our scientists recorded the sound at 438 cycles. So I didn't trust him. But then when 432 was getting to be more popular, let me do the whole album at 432 hertz. And as we are mixing down the vocalist, the female vocalist, I was enjoying what she was doing, and I turned to the engineer and said, "Let me just improv on another track, record it, but this is not for the album. Let me just have some fun."
Hmm.
Without warming up, I got into the into the isolation booth. I recorded, and I can tell you that it was the best I ever sang. It was the most in tune I ever sang.
Hmm.
And I'm going, I couldn't repeat it at 440.
Yeah.
So my body opened up more, my internal resonance opened up more. And that's when I became a believer because I felt it in my own body and you could hear the results. Uh, Even my engineer said, "You'd never sung in tune for a whole song before."
Hmm.
So that was very instructive to me. And that's why that album is now out there at 432 hertz, and
Hmm.
many of the other albums are at that way. Now, there's a lot of things on the internet and on YouTube that have 998 or 528 is the most healing frequencies. Uh, Listen to the music. If the music is unlistenable and boring,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what frequency is at. I'm
Yeah.
not going to listen to it. And a lot of other people won't too. And that's why they could give an hour or two albums away for free because that's about what it's worth.
Hmm.
It's not very useful, certainly to me, and I can't listen to most of it. But there's an audience for that too. But that's where that theory ties into reality. That
I think
okay,
what you said it was pretty cool that cause like when I listen to this sort of music, um it's not boring, but it's not addictive. It's sort of like it serves a purpose, you know? Like it's not that it's like I enjoy listening to it, but I don't crave more of it, sort of thing. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
right. And again, even as a kid, when I would listen to Baroque music on the radio, was a lot that it would drive me crazy.
Yeah.
And then when I would read, well, Baroque music and classical music is the most advanced music of mankind. I
Hmm.
go, no, it's not. And that
No,
was before
no.
I did my own past life research and other things. But there were people who believed that, and they wrote the books. So they put their opinion out there and called that fact. People are entitled to their opinion. They're not entitled to make up their own facts.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's cool that you say that because a lot of classical music is they sort of, I guess, sell you on the fact that they've trained for this X amount of years
Exactly.
under this person. But in reality, if the music itself is not genuine and has proper intention, like you were saying, it doesn't have a noticeable effect. And I think that people subconsciously know this and understand this, and that's why some people listen to certain music before they say want to play sports or
Right.
study. But I think that it's good that this sort of music is becoming more and more popular.
We need it. We need it
Yeah,
more now.
we definitely need it. And if people can just, at least not, I mean, maybe they don't need this music to get into like deeper meditation states, but if people can understand that it's a great tool that they can use, I think the world would be a lot better place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Some of the first audiences I worked with were some of the people in Silicon Valley, computer
Hmm.
people, and they were amazed because, and they were definitely not New Age or spiritual people.
Yeah.
But when I would I'd share the music and I would take them into a guided visualization, and then send them home with some of the music. They'd say, "Well, I did more creative thinking, more creative writing. Listen to your
Hmm.
music. I slept better. I had this and even in the guided imagery where we meet a wise old being in the forest, and then he has a message for you." I
Hmm.
said, they're going to kick me out of the room when I go woo woo on that one. They went deeper than my new age spiritual audiences. Because
Hmm.
they were already operating at a high level, and that's why they were senior scientists and
Hmm.
on that level, because so many scientists have that experience,
Yeah.
but they don't have the vocabulary or are afraid to tell other people that they are, tuning in on a spiritual level, or they don't want to share their secret and give their competitive advantage to their
Yeah.
competitors.
Yeah.
So there's all, and I've had them admit that to me. I listen to your music, but I can't, I'm a chief executive of this company or this, but I can't tell the world that. And that's why I can't, I could tell you, but you can't use my name because I don't want my competitors to know my secret. One of my secrets is I listen to your music when I'm doing creative problem solving or, new sales campaigns.
Hmm.
And that was very impressive to me, but I couldn't, take that out, in
Yeah.
my newsletters. But nevertheless, there are a lot of people who do know that, but they're the leaders, and that's one of the reasons why they're the leaders, as opposed
Yeah.
to the we're talking about here. How can this improve your life? Well, the more you get into when my kind of music started getting out there, when I couldn't talk about chakras or brain waves, the
Hmm.
whole field of stress management and holistic medicine was coming out at the same time, which, because I had gotten mononucleosis 3 times by the time I got out of college,
Oh wow.
I was picking up diseases way too much.
Uh-huh.
And I got allergic to penicillin and antibiotics. And I said, I have to learn how to heal myself. And that was just when the field of holistic medicine was coming out. So I said, I want to get to those conferences. And that's where I started learning about herbs and meditation. And how a lot of people got to find out about meditation was their doctor said, for stress management, you need to learn to relax. Now, they may call it relaxation and not meditation, because meditation, oh, my church says meditation is the work of the devil. But relaxation, everybody could do that. But early on, when I would ask people, what do you think of what is relaxation to you? Well, it's watching a football game. It's watching a basketball game. I go, are you kidding? With all the, oh, I hope they get that,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not relaxation.
Uh,
So people have no idea what relaxation was. So the basic things about how their body and mind work, nothing in our educational system was giving them the experience or the information they need. And now some people are getting through TikTok and YouTube, but still in schools, hardly at all. And the schools that were teaching yoga and
Yeah.
meditation, of course, are now being under attack from the Trump administration and everybody else who don't want people to know these things. And why would they not want people to know? Physician, in medicine is physician, heal thyself. Why would people not want people to know themselves? Because they want to control other people. And if you have a frightened, stressed out population, you can control them more easily. And that makes sense to me as to why this information has been kept
Yeah.
out of the educational system.
So it's actually it's cool that you say that because I think big pharma would be extremely against something where you can just listen and it heals yourself.
Absolutely.
You can,
In 1978, I had a pharmaceutical rep come up to me after one of my talks and say, "We don't like that you're saying that people could just listen to your music instead of taking aspirin for a headache." I
yeah,
said, "I sell, 10,000 albums a year. You sell 1 billion aspirin. I'm not a threat." And he says,
pretty
"But we
crazy.
know where this could lead. If people are able to control their own headaches by listening to a little bit of music, uh, and so then I actually had an ad designed where it was like an album and kind of a doctor's bag and a stethoscope saying, 'Headache, take 2 Halpern and call me in the morning,' showing my cassettes and albums. And I got in trouble for that. And then a couple of years ago, the FDA said, 'You're making a health claim for that, and you're not a medical doctor. So if you don't stop saying that, we're going to put you out of business.'"
Okay.
Me and some other people. And just, last month or so with RFK Jr. taking over the FDA, that part of the FDA is not going to put sound healers out of business like they were threatening to do. Because the word sound healing in 1975, my lawyers told me, you cannot use the word healing, and that's why it does not appear on any of my albums. But now all over the internet, everybody's saying sound healing this, sound healing this music heals. And I said, "So why are you picking on me?" And the FDA guy actually said, "Because you're number one in the field. We're not going to go after somebody that no one listens to. We're going after you. You're the leader in the field. Thank you very much. Your albums and your PR says you're the leader in the field. Well, I started 50 years ago. I am. Well, therefore, we're going to come after you."
Yeah.
But now they're cooled out. And that was the same thing with brainwave entrainment. They actually said, "We think that on your album, like Deep Alpha, it says brainwave entrainment music for meditation and healing and relaxation. We think that's a medical claim." I said, "No, it's like brainwave entrainment is a physiological response of the brain." I was going to give you one other example. Entrainment. There's two kinds of entrainment that I like to separate. There's physical entrainment in beats per minute. So when there's a beat in music, you can tap your foot. And your foot is entrained to the music. Obvious. With brainwaves, you don't tap your foot, at 8 cycles per second, but your brain picks up on it automatically. And particularly on albums that add brainwave entrainment, it's more obvious. But all my albums, as I came to understand, are entrained from my own brainwaves, using the music as a carrier waves, that was getting recorded into the music, but I didn't have to talk about it as such because no one would know what I was talking about anyway. But now when we can add it as a technology for adding brainwave entrainment, it becomes an added thing. And yet, if you listen to and check out some of the other videos on YouTube, what you hear, free brainwave entrainment on our website, you'll hear things that sound like ba 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 ba. I go, "Excuse me, maybe that'll entrain your brain, but it makes me nauseous and I have to go to the bathroom." It's like X-Lax. Because yes, you can entrain the brain, but I'm an artist, I'm a musician, I want to do it with sensitivity, so it's very subtle. And guess what? The brain is very subtle. It can pick up on subtle pulses in the music that you may not even hear. On my own albums, if you listen carefully, you could hear at the beginning and end of some of the tracks the little wah 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 wah, wah at the beginning, but I bury it within the music so that it doesn't get in the way of the music, but just adds another dimension. And that's one of the reasons why my first version of Deep Alpha in 2012, I believe, got nominated for a Grammy, even though the Grammy said, we don't want people like you to win a Grammy.
Yeah.
The musicians who listened to it had an experience. They said, I don't know what this is, but I feel good when I listen. I'm going to, vote for him. We can't prove it, but I know I got close to almost winning. And if I had won the Grammy that year, I had a little speech ready that I would have been kicked off stage because I would have run too long, but I was going to say some stuff, but I didn't win, so I couldn't say it.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say the year before, an album that included the movie song What's It All About, Alfie, with Michael Caine in it, won. It was a solo guitar album that had nothing to do with healing or new age music at all, but it wasn't a rock song. It was just solo guitar. I said, it's not what it's about, Alfie. It's all about alpha waves. And let me tell you about alpha waves. And I could just see them getting ready to take the hook and get me off stage. And in fact, when they announced it, and now the winner for new age music, and I stood up in my seat.
No,
and it wasn't my name. And the people all around me heard me say some, four-letter words. But that was as close as I got. But that whole week, the script of what I was going to say in the 30 or 40 seconds that I was allowed, I would just, maybe in the middle of the night, I'd get 3 sentences. And then the next day, I would get a little editing to that. So I knew I was getting guidance of what to say to make maximum use to educate the huge audiences watching the Grammys. Didn't happen. So I continued to write about it and write articles. Who was the first musician to write articles about brainwave entrainment? Me. Who was the first the guy to write articles about the healing powers of music in Yoga Journal, New Age Journal? It was me. Other musicians didn't even know about the field until they read about it from me mostly. And then, they said, okay, we think we could get into this. But I was karmically aligned to this. And as I point out in my memoir, there were so many synchronicities that would happen where I would meet somebody literally going around a corner and bump into somebody who I always wanted to meet. And I'd bump into them at an expo. Or I would send a letter to Dr. John Diamond with the muscle testing. Or I would, when Ravi Shankar was in town doing a concert, I would sneak, because I'm also a reviewer, I gave myself a press credential from the magazine I worked for, and would get backstage and was all ready to interview him and invite him to be on my next album. But the PR lady said, oh, he's done interviewing. Sorry, you can't interview. But I would, coming from New York, I did a lot of things that people would be amazed if they know that I did. But then all the other things, like meeting the scientists that I met in 1969 and January 1970, if I had never met them, I never would have gotten involved in research, because people said in the New Age spiritual community, that music is great for meditation. Thank you so much. No one ever said, how do we know that it's really different than this other music? And the scientist said, prove it. But to prove it, you need to do scientific measurement biofeedback. And, again, I'm not a scientist. I said, so how am I going to do it? You need to hire scientists. So I said, okay, who do I hire? Well, we happen to know a scientific team that's doing research. I said, great, I'll hire them. And that's how I began. And Dr. Stanley Kripke helped set up the scientific paradigm, the experimental protocol, so that I've been criticized, but no one has ever criticized the experimental design and protocol, because it was steel, it was bulletproof.
Yeah.
So they just make fun of other things. But, we were connected to the leading scientists in the world in 1973. And then from that, at the conferences, I would be in touch and meet with so many other people, including the son and grandson of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet who predicted in 1944 that the healing powers of music will be medicine in the medicine of the future. And when I met them at a conference at the Edgar Cayce Foundation, they said, "We know our grandfather is proud of what you're doing," because this is what he was talking about in some of his readings. And when I read some of his readings talking about the healing powers of music, I had the lights went on in my head. And there was a prayer in one book that talks about the musician's prayer, where your job as a musician is to serve the highest and best in the audience, to not play from ego, but to be of service. Well, I had never heard of that before. It was to show people, what a great musician I am. But then when your perspective is to be of service, well, the prayer was on the right-hand page and it continued to the left-hand page. And what I remember is I was speaking the words that I hadn't read yet. And when I turned the page, it was like, whoa, that's right there, but I didn't even see them. How did I do that? I don't know. But when I told the librarian and the people that I was working with at the Edgar Cayce Foundation that we don't even have that book.
Oh,
Well, I found it in your library, so you must. And then we found the one copy. They didn't even know they had it. And they didn't know that lesson and reading for the composer's and the musician's prayer was in there. So I was the one that helped remind them what Edgar Cayce was saying, but of course his son and grandson know. So that was part of the external validation that I got over the years. And when I was in Egypt in 1980 and 81, I had a lot of past life experiences. And according to my tour guide, I vanished at the Temple of Abydos, and that's why they left me. And
uh-huh.
I was stuck behind a big metal gate where people aren't allowed. How do you even get there? I don't know. And one of my friends on the tour bus made them come back. Otherwise, I might not be having this discussion with you right now.
Oh, wow.
But there were things like that would happen that I can't explain, but I was being guided. And it was like, even the fact that I had a near-death experience when I was being born, and some other situations that contributed to my hypersensitivity to sound and lights and other things. It seems like that's all part of the plan, that I needed to be so sensitive in order to be open to the good parts of sound and music. And then being bored with classical music, and at a certain point, even though I was getting good with improvising and jazz, it was like, is that all there is? That's not enough to build a lifetime on. And I was going to go back and be a professor of sociology at a college, which is what I got my degree in. And then when the new music came through, it was like, forget that. This is what I'm supposed to do. It was the first time that I ever understood what it meant to have a calling, to be, just like priests say, well, I have a calling to be in the priesthood. There was no priesthood of sound healers, but there was a ministry of sound healing that I understood that's what I am part of. And it goes back to Pythagoras, it goes back to the ancient Egyptians, and now I'm bringing it back into modern day.
Thank you for bringing it back, honestly. Where did there's a gap. There's the ancient teachings, right? And there's all this time before this new age movement of spirituality. What happened in between? Where was the loss,
Some of the loss came from the church that banned music like that.
Mhm.
But and even them think, well, how did Johann Sebastian Bach, how did he compose hundreds of songs? He was channeling, but of course he didn't say it. Mozart was channeling and talked about it, but he couldn't use the word channeling. People like Schumann were channeling, but he couldn't use those words, and some others did, and they called him crazy and they locked him up. So it was, and then deal with people like Liszt and Chopin, who were clearly tuning into things. And then you get into the 1880s and 90s, the Impressionist school of music, Debussy and Satie and Ravel. They were bringing in some of this aspect, but because it wasn't fancy enough and wasn't impressive enough for the critics and other people, it got squished down, and it wasn't as dramatic as a Mozart symphony or a Beethoven symphony, the big pompous, grandiose aspects. And then entertainment came in, and people want music you could dance to. Well, they couldn't dance to this kind of music. And then when jazz moved from swing in the 1920s and 30s to 40s to bebop, you couldn't dance to that. And you had to be an incredible musician to even play that fast and improvise that fast, but it still didn't have feeling. And that was a movement developed by musicians to keep out audiences who were not tuned in. But when jazz music with John Coltrane and Alice Coltrane and Miles Davis got started getting into modal music with one chord, they were studying Indian music. And when I started hearing that was when, oh, that kind of jazz, that I'm into. It wasn't mind games playing it. It was like just like the alap portions of a raga. And that's what they were studying. And that was my entree in 1968, 67, reading, really tuning into John Coltrane, A Love Supreme, to the work of Gurdjieff and Sufi music, to the fact that music could be a viable way of meditation and a portal, an access to get into higher states of consciousness. And that was just something I was always attracted to. But again, a lot of that was heavily rhythmic. And there was a certain level that I couldn't get beyond. And I didn't know what was going to be next until I had that experience where I heard the music and heard the voice saying, this is the music you are supposed to bring out into the world. And again, it took, a number of years because we didn't know about the internet at that point, when now there's people all over the world hearing my music anytime they want. Before the internet was streaming music or even MP3s through Apple Music, you had to buy a CD or you had to buy a record and play it yourself or listen to the radio. But then you could never get it, to hear exactly what you want. I used to call that radio roulette. You put on a station and hope for a song that you like. Once an hour, maybe you get one. And that's why most of what I listen to is my own music, because it gets me into the zone where I'm most creative, most relaxed, and it helped me from being sick all the time. So I was the first patient who got healed by my music. I was the first executive who got more creative listening to my music because it put me in that state. And I wrote my first album, my first main book, the one called Sound Health. I started listening to classical music, but I said, if you want to write a book, listen to classical music and listen to Baroque music. It makes you smarter. Listen to Mozart. It makes you smarter. That was all a lie. It was all hype. It was all just, And I said, well, I better start. Let me try my own music. And suddenly, I got more done the first day than I had done in 3 weeks listening to Mozart or Baroque music. And I said, that's it. And then the field of accelerated learning discovered my music and said, you know what? Your music works better than Baroque music or Mozart. And there's a book called The Mozart Effect. And there are other books that were not allowed to say how well my music worked because the editors of the authors, Sheila Ostrander and Schroeder, their editor wouldn't let him say so much good stuff about my music because it undermined their thesis that slow classical music was also useful. But most classical music is fast. In a Baroque composition, there's a fast song, there's a slow movement, the andante or the adagio, and then another fast one. So I would rarely get past the fast songs because it made me too nervous until people started playing just the adagio portions. And then it was, at least in the ballpark. But one other thing for what you were talking about, the same piece of music written by Mozart or any composer played by 2 or 3 different people is going to sound different and have a different effect. So it's not just who composed it, but who performed it. If they are stressed, that's going to weaken the effect of the music. And you hear the different versions of music. Well, it's fast. That's how we want to do. That's our interpretation. What's your interpretation? It's not what the composer intended. And John Diamond again was someone else who tuned in. I worked with another brilliant scientist that you might want to check out, Dr. Manfred Klein, Clynes, at MIT and other places, that he worked on computer programs to identify the pure pulse of different composers that he could quantify, and then he could play himself. He was a concert pianist who was also a computer wizard, and he was starting to get famous, but gave up performing and got into the world. But he's on the internet. He's passed now, but a brilliant man, and I studied with him, and he played. I remember when the first time I heard him play Bach, it sounded unlike any Bach I had ever heard. And I said, I've listened to Bach. I've never heard that. He says, all the other people were wrong. This is how Bach sounded. And that was what my body and my brain said. He's right. And I was going to, we started to record an album, but also when he played the piano, sometimes he'd hit it so hard he broke a couple strings and we couldn't finish the session.
That's unfortunate.
So, but a brilliant man.
Yeah.
So I think we got to a lot of your questions. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, you covered most of them, honestly.
Right.
Um,
and one of the other ones is what sort of states of consciousness can music induce? Well, it can induce, meditation, deeper meditation, healing. One of the other things, the scientists that have studied the healing, where the brain is when the brain is in the most healing states, is in the alpha state of 8 hertz, and my experience is in deep theta at 4 hertz.
mm-hmm.
And I've worked with other scientists, and when you're in that state, this is what we didn't touch on yet, is that the other phenomenon we talked about entrainment, there's resonance and of course the mental relationship to music. So if I sing this pattern that you all recognize out there, mm-hmm. the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, how many of you are hearing that last note in your head? Most of the people are holding their breath, waiting for that final do.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I call this the anticipation response. The predictability response. We are hearing things that are not played based on the fact that we've been culturally conditioned mm-hmm. to respond to patterns that we're familiar with. Mm-hmm. Well, that locks you into a certain state that is not mindful. Mindful is being in the present moment. If you're predicting the future, you're not in the present moment. Mm-hmm. And healing and relaxation only happens in the present moment. So that's another very important thing. It pissed off reviewers and critics because they're always trying to analyze it with the left brain. When you're in the moment, the hemispheres of your brain synchronize and balance. Yeah, and that is also when the most effective healing happens.
So does your music sort of induce sort of hemisync?
Yes, okay. Even without hemisync. And I actually visited with Robert Monroe.
Was this before you knew what hemisync was, that like you produced it and then you researched it after and realized that it does induce hemisync?
Well, hemisync is the name he gave it, but brainwave entrainment started like in the 1920s. Okay. And I was aware of that before Robert Monroe went public with his best-selling book, Journeys Out of the Body, where he would describe making his own tapes using synthesizer sounds, but not music. And I was interested in that, and we spoke. I visited him out in Virginia, and we were going to do some project. I was going to license some music, but his technology was old, used cassette, and there was wow and flutter, and it destroyed the music. If you're going, like a ocean sound,
Yeah.
it didn't really matter. And then he would put the frequencies underneath. But the concept was he was one of the first to put that out there. But I was doing brainwave entrainment in 1979 on some of my albums, but it was only on a couple of songs. And in 1991, when I was uh, filmed for the TV show back when it was good called 48 Hours,
Hmm.
they were doing a program on New Age healing, on New Age, and part of that was New Age healing music. So they had me and the opposite of me, which was Yanni, who is not about healing. He says, not all New Age is about healing, but I demonstrated in the studio. I did some live recording, and then I said, now let me add the entrainment, and I played. And then I said, okay, so now I'm going to play the music with the entrainment, which they could barely hear, and the music without the entrainment. And the producer and the hostess said, "Oh my gosh, I could feel, it seemed I could feel that it's totally different. This is going to blow the audience's mind. We're going to make history on TV."
Yeah.
Well, before the program aired, they got fired. The new editor said, "I don't want the good stuff on there," so they cut out that part. But that song is on my album called uh, "Higher Ground," and the song is called "48 Hours."
Hmm.
In honor of that. So I was putting that out there, but I was also, so that was not even, but before I met Monroe, I had read the book, so I knew about the technology. But in 1993, the scientists and the researchers that I was dealing with said, if you're interested in this, we think you'll be interested in this. So why don't you read this book, or why don't you check this guy? So I was one of the first people to secretly put that in my music,
Mm.
but it was only a track or two, and those were the tracks that had the most powerful healing effects, but people didn't know why.
Yeah.
But since no one knew what brainwave entrainment was, I didn't tell them. But I said it on 48 Hours, and there was a description, and they cut out most of that. And then, some years later, when I was also working with, starting with that same trip in 1986, 87, with a spiritual master named Charles Cannon, who went by the name, first was Brother Charles and then Master Charles. He was the personal secretary of Swami Muktananda in India. And when he came to America in 1986, 87, I was told about him. So I called him up. He says, "I know who you are. I was listening to your music on the hill at the ashram, meditating to your cassette of Spectrum Suite and Chakra Suite.
Wow.
So I know who you are."
That's,
And he took what I was doing about synchronizing hemispheres. The name of his organization was Synchronicity Association. So in a sense, I helped create his organization and his approach to recording. And then he would add his mantras, etc., and toning. So yeah, I've known about all of this for a while, but again, because there was no way to say enough on the cassette or an album or even a CD jacket to really describe it. But people like myself and Richard Sutton would do some of that. But as I'm finding out now, a lot of people didn't know what those words meant. I would say this music features brainwave entrainment to get you into an alpha state. But they didn't understand some of the things that we talked about in the first section of this interview.
mhm.
That it's actually an electronic tone, that we can dial in at a specific frequency. So if I want to do 8 cycles, it's
Uh-huh.
or if it's 4 cycles, Now, how does that also relate? And I'm happy we had time for this also. Is if you listen to crystal bowls,
Uh-huh.
you don't hear that because it's a bowl, bong, and it's pure tone. It's like a tuning fork.
Yeah.
Not a lot of melody, not a lot of rhythm. That's the beauty of it. It's just pure sine wave tone.
Yeah.
But before that, for thousands of years, there were Tibetan, 5 metal singing bowls and Japanese temple bowls. And I was always attracted to that. But as a jazz musician, as an improvising musician, after 5 minutes, I would, kind of get bored. And I was at a lecture by the spiritual teacher and author, master, Alan Watts.
Oh, wow.
Speaking to our graduate class in 1973, and I was in the audience. We're in a big, maybe 500,000 seat auditorium. I'm midway up the aisle, but I was sitting on the edge just in case I needed to leave or
Yeah.
whatever. And he has this big Tibetan temple bowl, big dark bowl. And at one point, he hits it, and it's this great resonating tone. And he hits it again. And by the third time, maybe I'm getting a little restless. And in this whole audience, he looks right at me and he says, apparently, some of you do not know how to listen to a meditative temple bowl. He
Hmm.
says, here's what you do: you turn off your mind, you listen to the furthest away sound until it fades away. There's nowhere else you need to go. And that's something that I would bring into all my introductions. There's nowhere else you need to go right now. You need to just be here now. Like Ram Dass said, be here now. But that's also HEAR, not just HERE. And so I got to thank him for that. I said, now I understand. And when I was in Japan, I was teaching there in 1994, and one of the workshops was right down the block from a temple supply store.
Hmm.
So during the break, I went in there with my Japanese guide, who was a translator, and I'm trying all the bowls because I wanted to buy my own set of meditative bowls. And at one point, the sales clerk leaves me alone, and I'm hitting the bowls, and I see a door and some stairs, and something says, go up those stairs. And no one's looking. I go up the stairs, and I see these two huge bowls. And I
Hmm.
hit one, and it's, like the one that Alan Watts had. And I hit another one, and I have an out-of-body experience. I said,
Wow.
whoa, this is amazing. And just then, the guys downstairs hear me. They run upstairs and say, out, 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 gaijin, gaijin, foreigner. You're not allowed up here. This is only for,
Wow.
Zen priests and Japanese priests, only Japanese up here. So I go, okay, but I want to buy that one. No, 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 not allowed, not allowed. But there was a series of things. I tell my Japanese hosts who said, well, unfortunately, even though we did two concerts of 2,000 people apiece, we didn't make any money, so we can't pay you any money for your 2 weeks in Japan. I
Hmm.
said, well, that doesn't make sense to me, but I couldn't argue because they ran the show. I said, but at least do this. You're Japanese, buy that bowl for me and get them to send it to me. I said, we can't do that. And that's where we left it. I left Japan. 6 months later, a big truck arrives in my driveway with this huge crate, and I open up because I see all the Japanese letters
Hmm.
and words on it. I got the bowl, and that's
Wow.
on some of my albums, and I use that every morning as part of my meditation. One or two hits, and it just gets me into the zone because what's happening? It's boom and go whoa 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 whoa. That is brainwave entrainment, and that's what the ancient bowl makers were masters of, building in brainwave entrainment to the bowls that they would make. Now, not all the bowls
Hmm.
have as good entrainment. Even small ones, some are much better than others. In many of the talks I would give at metaphysical bookstores, many would sell bowls, and I would demonstrate. I'd just take a couple off the shelf and go, here, audience, let me show you. Here's one, bong, and I hit bong, and then I hit the third one. I go, whoa, this one just got sold. This one's going home with me. I mean, it was that instantaneous, and they could all hear the difference, but they all looked exactly the same. So it's just like with crystals. When I first, was getting into crystals, I said, you run your hand over crystals, and sometimes you might feel an energy, and that crystal is for you. I said, I've never felt energy from a crystal. What do
Hmm.
you mean? A different they're all crystals. And then the first time I'm doing that, and I felt one crystal that was a magnet, I said, I'm buying that one. And that's when that became real to me. Just like with the bowl. Until then, I must have been hearing some cheap bowls because I never had that experience. But then, this was years after Alan Watts, and I was already buying some bowls. And then the ones that weren't that good, I would give to friends. I'd make birthday gifts, or and they loved them because it was the best bowl they ever had because they never had a bowl. But for mine, the ones that I recorded, and they're on my albums called Tonal Alchemy, and I'll be using them again. And then, of course, I have a bunch of crystal bowls for my crystal bowl healing album, which I then would add some music to. And but again, the basic premise of my music and their music is that you don't have to think about the music. It's not an intellectual exercise as it is with classical music. It's music, and that goes back to your very first question, that gets you into the zone. It slows down your brain waves. It shuts down your thinking, analytical mind and puts you in the present moment. And that's where the healing happens. That's where the connection with your spirit, that's where body, mind, and spirit get aligned. And that's also why my first album, Chakra Suite, that was one of the other questions, so I'm happy I remembered to come back to this, starts at the first chakra, where I use the sound, the keynote that relates to the first chakra is based on the keynote of C, and go up to the keynote of D. I didn't make up this sequence, but it's the sequence that we know as the major scale. But also these colors have been around in metaphysical traditions for thousands of years. So the first chakra is red, not in every system, but in the Rosicrucians and many other systems. The first chakra red, second chakra orange, third chakra, the solar plexus is yellow. It's solar, it's yellow, that's why it's yellow. And the heart chakra up to violet at the top. And then there was a scientist and a medical doctor in England, Dr. Roland Hunt, who used this system. And I tried other systems before I used this system on the album, because this is one that worked. I worked with other scientists. We did muscle testing. We would project the colors onto somebody's back. They didn't know what color it was, but when we muscle tested them, when the color was right for the chakra, their arm would get stronger. And if it was the wrong color, it would get weakened. And that's why I said, that's why I want to license your music for my healing work. And that's some of the research I did. Nobody knows about that. I didn't just make this up myself. Some people say, oh, he made up this system. No, I credit the ancient traditions that I built upon, but no one had ever made a soundtrack for tuning the chakras like I did. And the scientists that I worked with that had the equipment that could measure the balance of the chakras, again with Itzhak Bentov, his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, talked about entrainment, talked about bioresonance and chakras, and how when you tune up the first chakra, it sets up a standing wave through the other chakras up into your head. So here's the science part, that then through the way it works with your breath, it pulsates your brain, and then through the piezoelectric effect, when you pulsate an electrical object like the brain, a nervous electricity, sets up an associated electromagnetic field around the head. Now, why is that important? Because that electromagnetic field is naturally at 8 hertz, and that bioresonates and entrains the fundamental harmonic frequency of the Schumann resonance.
Well, thank you so much for those stories and insights. I kind of found that I resonated with a lot of things that you said, especially when you mentioned sort of hearing like divine tunes that during like different sort of states of meditation.
Right.
I've experienced that before, and I unfortunately don't have the skills to sort of take that and sort of create like you do. But I'm very thankful that we do have people like you who are able to take music from higher like vibrational places, beings, states, and sort of put them into this sort of dimensional vibration sphere so everyone can benefit from them.
Right. Well, as I learned from my teachers in Buffalo, that's the role of the artist. The artist has done that for thousands of years. I'm just happy that that's part of my karma. Let us stay in touch after today. Yeah. And we'll continue this conversation offline.
Okay. Thank you so much for everything.
Bye for now.
Yeah.